Okay, so our last video we looked at how a muscle cell contracts. We went through the steps from when the neuron sends an impulse to the neuromuscular junction, causing that muscle cell to depolarize all the way through to actin and myosin, and ultimately to the power stroke and contraction. So we've covered that. Now I want to look at some things related to the muscle cell and how it is able to form and utilize ATP. And so again, one of the huge things here is that ATP is the primary energy source for this process to occur. You have to have ATP for the muscle cell to contract. Right? Now, in other classes, exercise physiology, which some of you will take, we go way more into depth as far as how this occurs and the process of forming ATP. We're going to keep it a little simple for this class. We're just going to focus on the fact that skeletal muscle needs ATP, preferably via what we call aerobic metabolism. Aerobic meaning with oxygen. So it prefers to form ATP with oxygen and utilizing glucose. Now again, other classes will go way more in depth into that, but glucose is a precursor to help form ATP, adenosine triphosphate. Now, unfortunately, that doesn't always occur. And in fact, with muscle contraction, a lot of times it doesn't occur. And so that is when we have to call on more anaerobic means and other means to form ATP. This is where stored glycogen, which is the storage form of glucose in muscle and in liver, is needed. This is where myoglobin is also necessary. But all of these are means to form ATP. And so when we get into strenuous activity, we now have to engage other non-aerobic means. And two of the ways we do this, one is through utilizing what we call phosphocreatine, or creatine phosphate. Some of you, if you work out a lot, you're familiar with the word creatine. It's a little different than what we're talking about here. But I want you to grasp that creatine phosphate, phosphocreatine, is a very quick means. It involves just one step in order to convert it to ATP. Unfortunately, those stores are very, very limited. So we can only use that for 4, 5, 6, 7 seconds before that's no longer applicable to form ATP. And so when that doesn't work, we have anaerobic glycolysis. Now again, these systems are way more in depth than this, and other classes we go way more in depth. But I just want you to grasp here that there are a couple means, 3 means, to form ATP for these muscle cells to continually have it available so you can continue to have a power stroke, you can continue to have muscle contraction, and continue to do whatever activity you want to do. Now, truth be told, there's another factor. That even if ATP is available, not every muscle cell is the same. And this is where we get into this idea of muscle fiber types. And so what I want to do, we're going to actually show you a video about 3 minutes that kind of gives us a background, gets us caught up on where we've been so far, and then introduces this topic as far as muscle cell types go.
Muscles are the driving force of all movements in the body, varying from lifting, running, walking, and even organ function. The muscular system consists of 3 major muscle types: cardiac muscles, which are responsible for function of your heart; smooth muscles, which are responsible for the function of all your other organs; and skeletal muscles, which are responsible for, as the name suggests, the movement of your bones. Both smooth and cardiac muscles function involuntarily, meaning they operate by themselves. Skeletal muscles, on the other hand, function voluntarily and are under our conscious control. There are 3 different skeletal muscle fiber types, known as type 1, type 2A, and type 2X fibers. The difference of size, color, contractual speed, contractual force, and energy source classifies each fiber. Type 1 fibers, also known as slow twitch fibers, are the smallest fiber types with the darkest red color. It has a fairly slow twitch speed and produces a relatively small amount of force when contracted. It has high amounts of mitochondria, which are organelles within each cell that uses oxygen to produce energy. Although the force generated is fairly small, type 1 fibers are highly fatigue resistant, allowing it to be active for long periods of time. They are the primary fibers used during low-intensity activities with steady oxygen consumption, such as walking, jogging, or aerobics. Type 2A fibers, aka moderate fast twitch fibers, are also red but intermediate in size. These larger fibers typically use a combination of oxygen and glucose as a source of energy. This combination allows for quicker contracting speed and higher force output compared to type 1 fibers. However, fatigue resistance isn't as high. These fibers are typically activated during anaerobic activities that are moderate in duration, such as a mile run, swimming, and short-distance cycling. Type 2X fibers, aka fast twitch fibers, are white in color due to their low oxygen capacity and by far the largest fiber type. It makes up for the lack of oxidative capacity by having extremely high levels of glucose in the stored form of glycogen, producing the fastest twitch speeds and the most force. The downside, though, is that the fiber fatigues quickly, burning out after 15 to 30 seconds. High-impact, heavy resistance activities such as lifting weights and sprinting will activate type 2X fibers the most. For any activity, your muscles follow a certain recruiting order. The slow twitch, low force, fatigue-resistant type 1 fibers are always activated first. When type 1 fibers are maxed out, type 2A fibers are activated, and then after those are maxed out, type 2X fibers are activated. This order, known as the Henneman's size principle, helps minimize muscle fatigue and allows precise motor control by using no more than the force necessary to complete a movement. Everyone has a genetically determined amount of each muscle fiber type. Some people are born with a predominant amount of a certain muscle fiber, making them effective with activities that favor those fibers. There have been some findings that suggest that type 2X fibers can change into type 2A fibers with proper training. However, this might simply be due to type 2X fibers showing higher oxygen capacity through physical adaptation. They are ultimately still type 2X fibers. Based on your exercises, which muscle fibers do you train the most?
Okay, so we get the idea that there are these different muscle fiber types, and we often break them up into type 1 and type 2. Now, the truth is there's variations of type 2, there's variations of type 1. We're going to keep it real simple. Type 1 being your more slower, what we call oxidative fibers. These fibers generally, they are not going to contract as quickly. However, they are able to utilize oxygen better to form ATP. They're more fatigue resistant. We could say they're more endurance oriented. Whereas type 2, we often say they're fast glycolytic, which means they're able to contract more quickly, produce more power in theory, but the trade-off being they're not as oxidative. They do not handle oxygen as well to form ATP, and therefore are a little more likely to fatigue. And so we would generally say they're not really endurance-oriented muscle cells. And one of the things to grasp here is that it's really easy to think, well, you might want to say, well, I'm a type 1 muscle person, I'm a type 2. The truth is, every muscle is different, and the truth is, every muscle cell inside a muscle is different. Even in a muscle that is very, very type 1, for example, like your soleus muscle, which is in your calf, lower calf. Soleus muscle is notoriously very type 1, which makes sense. You stand all the time. It's always being used. We don't need it to fatigue. And so not surprisingly, it's more of a type 1 muscle. Having said that, there are type 2 muscle cells inside that muscle. Right? And so understanding when we talk about fiber types, it's not that a muscle is type 1 or type 2. It is how much percentage of those cells are type 1, type 2, and how does that vary. Okay, so that's muscle fiber types. The last part of this is just, I want to get big picture as far as effective exercise and activity. And not surprisingly, exercise has an effect on skeletal muscle. And we can go through a list of things here of how exercise affects skeletal muscle, from obviously improving muscle tissue, increasing its size, which is actually increasing muscle cell size, not necessarily number. We call that hypertrophy. From stronger bones, which is indirectly related to muscle pulling on bone and causing those bones to be stronger. Cardiac muscle getting stronger, which is, of course, of great benefit. And there's a lot of benefits of exercise. Last thing I want to look at is aging. And so we've talked about exercise, and with aging, and your book goes into a little more of this, not surprisingly, as you may be aware, with aging, muscles change, muscle cell structure and changes. And so one of the things we see is a loss of muscle cells, with that a loss of protein, actin and myosin. So not surprisingly, we lose contractile force, we lose power. With that, we also lose some extensibility in muscle cells, in other words, ability to stretch, to be flexible. We see this particularly in the torso and upper legs. And we also see a decrease in height, which is partially related to muscle, partially related to cartilage in between spine. And all of these, when it comes to muscle, is going to have effect. We also see with muscle a decrease in contractile velocity, which is key. We don't have the same contraction speed as we age. And this becomes important when it comes to falls, when it comes to injury, the inability to deal with external forces as quickly as when we were younger. So again, all these slides are on Canvas for you. This finishes up muscle structure function. The next lecture we're going to look at is the nervous system and how do neurons form, how do they send impulses, what's an action potential, and most importantly, what is depolarization. So that'll be our next lecture.